The dust tasted of grit and failed promises. Cassidy Flynn shifted his weight from one worn boot to the other, the worn leather groaning in the oppressive silence of the high plains. In his pocket, his thumb traced the creased edges of a photograph. A woman named Phoebe, with hair the color of sun-bleached wheat and a smile that seemed to promise an end to the crushing loneliness of his ranch. For 6 months he had corresponded with her, his carefully penned letters describing his land, his hopes for a family, the quiet life he could offer. Her replies, written in a delicate, looping script, spoke of shared dreams. She was the cure for the silence that had settled over his life since his parents passed. A plume of dust on the horizon heralded the stagecoach's arrival. Cassidy's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, unfamiliar rhythm. He straightened his collar and ran a hand through his sweat-dampened hair, trying to resemble the steady, capable man he'd portrayed in his letters. The coach rattled to a halt, the horses lathered with sweat and sighing plumes of hot breath into the arid air. The driver, a grizzled man named Jed, grunted a greeting. "Got your delivery, Flynn." The coach door swung open. Cassidy held his breath, the image of Phoebe bright in his mind. But the woman who emerged was not her. She was slight, her dark hair pulled back so severely it emphasized the sharp, intelligent angles of her face. Her eyes, the color of dark, polished almonds, were wide and alert, scanning the desolate landscape with an unnerving intensity. She wore dark, practical trousers and a tunic, clothes utterly alien to the calico dresses of the women in town. In her arms, she clutched a small, lacquered wooden box as if it were a lifeline. Cassidy's prepared smile faltered and died. He looked past her, into the shadowed interior of the coach, expecting Phoebe to appear behind her. The coach was empty. He looked at Jed, his confusion hardening into a knot in his stomach. "Jed, this isn't Miss Phoebe Miller." Jed shrugged, already tossing down a small, battered travel bag. Name on the ticket said Flynn's Crossing. "This is her." Paid in full, he spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Not my business beyond that." The woman stepped down, her movements graceful but stiff. As her bag landed, Cassidy noticed a dark, ugly stain marring the canvas near the bottom. A deep, rusty brown that looked unervingly like dried blood. His gaze shot back to her. Her face was a mask of stoicism, but he could see a flicker of something else in her eyes, exhaustion, and a fear so profound it was almost a physical presence. She took a step toward him, stumbled slightly, and spoke. The words were soft, melodic, and utterly incomprehensible. It wasn't an accent he couldn't place. It was a different language entirely. I don't understand," Cassidy stammered, taking an involuntary step back. He held up the photograph of Phoebe, his thumb obscuring the cheerful smile. "Phoebe Miller. I'm waiting for Phoebe Miller." The woman looked at the photograph, then at his face. Her expression didn't change, but she gave a short, sharp shake of her head. She spoke again, her tone more urgent this time, and gestured with her chin back toward the road the coach had come from. It was a gesture of warning, a plea. He didn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear. Danger. Jed, impatient, climbed back onto his seat. "She's your problem now, Flynn." With a crack of the whip, the stagecoach lurched forward, leaving Cassidy standing in a cloud of dust with a stranger, a language barrier as wide as the plains, and a growing sense of dread. He was alone with a woman who wasn't the one he'd waited for, a woman who carried a mysterious box, a bloodstain on her bag, and a terror in her eyes that the vast, empty landscape seemed to amplify. The silence he had hoped to fill had just been replaced by 1,000 unspoken questions, each one more dangerous than the last. He looked from her guarded face to the endless horizon, the isolation of his ranch suddenly feeling less like a comfort and more like a trap. The wagon ride back to the ranch was a study in tense silence. Cassidy's mind raced, a frantic catalog of mistakes and misunderstandings. Had the agency mixed up the tickets? Was this woman a runaway, a thief, dumped at his remote stop by a driver eager to be rid of her? He glanced at her, She sat ramrod straight on the buckboard, the lacquered box held firmly in her lap. Her gaze was fixed on the rolling hills, but her focus seemed inward, her knuckles white where she gripped the box. The initial shock was curdling into a sour mix of disappointment and suspicion. This was not the simple, happy beginning he had paid for and prayed for. When they arrived, the ranch looked starker than usual under the harsh afternoon sun. The small, sturdy cabin he'd built with his own hands seemed to shrink, its solitude more pronounced. He gestured for her to get down, the motion stiff and unwelcoming. She slid off the seat with a quiet grace, but as her feet hit the ground, a sharp hiss of pain escaped her lips. She pressed a hand to her side, her face momentarily contorting. The bloodstain on the bag. Cassidy's eyes narrowed. "You're hurt," he said, the words useless but instinctive. She followed his gaze to her side and then quickly straightened, her mask of composure sliding back into place. She shook her head, a clear denial, but the lie was betrayed by the pallor of her skin. He let out a frustrated sigh. He couldn't just leave her here, injured and alone, no matter who she was. His father's voice echoed in his memory, a low rumble of principle. "You don't turn your back on someone in need. Not ever." He led her inside. The cabin was sparse but clean, smelling of pine wood and coffee. A small, neatly framed version of Phoebe's photograph sat on the mantelpiece, a testament to a future that had just evaporated. The woman's eyes flickered towards it, and a flicker of understanding, or perhaps resignation, crossed her face. Cassidy pointed to a chair at the simple wooden table. She sat, placing the box carefully in front of her. He moved to the stove, his actions mechanical as he put the coffee pot on. He needed a moment to think. What was he supposed to do? Take her to town? To the sheriff? But her reaction at the stage stop, the urgent warning in her eyes, gave him pause. She was running from something. Handing her over to the law might be the very thing she feared. He poured 2 cups of coffee, the bitter aroma filling the small space. He placed one in front of her. She looked at the dark liquid, then up at him, her gaze searching. He decided to try again. He picked up Phoebe's photograph from the mantel and set it on the table, pointing first to the picture, then to himself. "Cassidy," he said, tapping his own chest. "Phoebe," he pointed to the photo again. The woman watched him intently. She understood. She pointed to the photo and shook her head slowly. Then, she tentatively pointed to herself. "Liwi," she said. The name was soft, a whisper of sound. Progress, however small. He then gestured to her side, his expression questioning. "Hurt?" Liwi's jaw tightened. She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the box on the table. It was clear the two were connected, her injury and the object she guarded so fiercely. After a long moment, she seemed to come to a decision. With a deep breath, she gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Cassidy's resolve hardened. Right or wrong, he had to know the extent of it. He gestured toward the small back room that served as his bedroom. "Come," he made a motion of dabbing a cloth, of tending a wound. She watched him, her eyes weighing his intent. Finally, she rose and followed him. Inside, he pointed to the edge of the bed. She sat, never letting the box leave her hands. He fetched the tin box of medical supplies, bandages, carbolic soap, a bottle of whiskey for cleaning wounds. He knelt before her, his movements slow and deliberate so as not to alarm her. He gestured to her tunic. She understood. With trembling fingers, she unfastened the clasps and pulled the fabric aside. Tucked against her side, just above her hip, was a makeshift bandage already soaked through with blood. He gently peeled it back. The wound was a long, shallow slice, not deep enough to be fatal but crudely stitched and inflamed at the edges. It wasn't an accident. It was a knife wound. His breath caught. This was far more serious than a simple misunderstanding. This woman, Liwi, was in mortal danger. He worked in silence, cleaning the wound with whiskey-soaked rags. She flinched, biting her lip to stifle a cry, but never made a sound. Her control was absolute, and in it he saw a strength that belied her small frame. As he carefully wrapped a fresh bandage around her torso, his hand brushed against hers. Her skin was cold. She didn't pull away. In that brief contact, a silent understanding passed between them. He was no longer just a bewildered rancher, and she was no longer just an unwanted arrival. He had made a choice. He was involved. That night, he gave her his bed and took a blanket to the floor by the hearth, his rifle resting against the wall beside him. Sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind whistling through the eaves, sounded like a threat. He stared into the dying embers of the fire, the face of the woman in the next room superimposed over the flames. Who was she? What was in that box? And who had tried to kill her for it? The simple, quiet life he had so desperately craved had been shattered. In its place was a tense, dangerous mystery, and he was standing right in the middle of it. The silence of the ranch was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of secrets. The next morning, the fragile truce of the cabin was shattered by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Cassidy was instantly on his feet, grabbing his rifle from its place by the hearth. He peered through the window. A lone rider was making his way up the long track to the cabin. The tin star pinned to the man's chest glinted in the morning sun. Sheriff Dalton.
Cassidy's scoot tightened.
Dalton was a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes, a man whose presence always felt more like a threat than a comfort. Liwi, hearing the rider, emerged from the bedroom. Her eyes widened in alarm when she saw the star. She backed away from the door, clutching her box, her previously calm demeanor gone, replaced by raw fear. "Get back in the room," Cassidy ordered in a low, urgent whisper. "And stay quiet." She didn't need to understand the words. His tone and the sheriff's approach were enough. She disappeared back into the bedroom, closing the door softly behind her. Cassidy took a deep breath, leaned his rifle against the wall near the door, and stepped onto the porch, forcing a neutral expression onto his face. "Mornin', Sheriff," he called out as Dalton reined in his horse. "What brings you all the way out here?" Dalton swung down from his horse, his movements slow and deliberate. He was a large man, his bulk straining the buttons of his shirt. He let his gaze drift over the cabin, lingering on the window of the back room. "Just making my rounds, Flynn. Heard the stage came through yesterday. Heard you were expectin' company." His smile was a thin, predatory slash. "A bride, I hear. Congratulations are in order." "There was a mix-up," Cassidy said, keeping his voice even. "She wasn't on it." Dalton's eyes, small and shrewd, narrowed. "That's so? Funny. Jed, the driver, seemed to think he dropped someone off. Said you two left together." He took a step closer, his voice dropping conspiratorially. "Look, Flynn, I'll be straight with you. We've had some trouble down at the railroad work camp. One of the Chinese laborers, a woman, made off with a company strongbox. Full of gold, they say. Caused a real stir. We tracked her to the stage depot. Figure she got on the first coach headin' anywhere." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "She's a slippery one, deceitful, dangerous even. You wouldn't happen to have seen a woman like that, would you? Small, dark hair. Doesn't speak a lick of English." The description was perfect. The lie came to Cassidy's lips with surprising ease. "Can't say that I have, Sheriff. Place has been empty except for me." Dalton's gaze was sharp, probing. He looked past Cassidy, toward the cabin door. "You mind if I take a look inside? Just to be thorough. For your own safety, of course." It wasn't a request. Cassidy felt a cold knot of anger form in his chest. This wasn't about the law. This was a hunt. "I do mind, Sheriff. This is my home. You got a warrant." The sheriff's smile vanished completely. A man with nothing to hide doesn't mind a friendly look around. "Flynn. Makes a fella wonder what you've got in there you're so keen to protect." He let his hand rest on the butt of his pistol. The threat was plain. Cassidy stood his ground, his body blocking the doorway. He was not a violent man, but a fierce, protective instinct had risen in him, an instinct he didn't know he possessed. He thought of Liwi, hiding in the back room, her knife wound a testament to the danger this man represented. "I've got my privacy," Cassidy said, his voice low and steady, "and I expect you to respect it." For a long moment, the two men stared at each other. The air crackled with unspoken violence. Dalton was assessing him, weighing the cost of pushing the issue. Cassidy didn't flinch. Finally, with a short, humorless laugh, Dalton backed away. "Have it your way, rancher. But if I find out you're harboring a fugitive, well, there are laws about that, too. Obstruction of justice is a serious crime." He swung himself back onto his horse, his eyes promising retribution. "If you see anything, you let me know." He turned his horse and trotted away, leaving a trail of dust and menace. Cassidy watched until he was a small speck on the horizon before sagging back against the doorframe, his heart pounding. He had crossed a line. He had lied to the law, protecting a woman he barely knew. The door creaked open behind him. Liwi stood there, her face pale, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and something else, gratitude. She looked at him, then at the rifle leaning against the wall, and she understood the risk he had just taken for her. He knew then, with absolute certainty, that turning back was no longer an option. Her danger was now his. After the sheriff left, the cabin felt smaller, the isolation no longer a comfort but a vulnerability. The unspoken questions between Cassidy and Liwi needed answers. He shut the door and turned to face her. The time for guessing was over. He needed to know what he was risking his life for. He gestured for her to sit at the table, his movements sharp with urgency. He sat opposite her, the small wooden table a battlefield of misunderstanding. He looked at her, then pointed out the window in the direction Dalton had gone, and drew a star in the air with his finger. He followed it by mimicking a man in chains, his meaning clear. "That man wants to arrest you." Liwi's face was grim. She nodded, her eyes never leaving his. She knew. He then pointed to the lacquered box, his expression a silent demand for the truth. For a long moment, she hesitated. Her gaze flickered from his face to the box, her entire being locked in a struggle between fear and the need for an ally. He could see the calculation in her eyes. Cassidy held her gaze, trying to project the sincerity he felt. He held up his hands, palms open, a universal gesture of peace. "Trust me." Finally, with a deep, shuddering breath, she slid the box to the center of the table. Her fingers, long and slender, worked at a hidden clasp. The lid lifted with a soft click. Cassidy leaned forward, his mind racing with possibilities. Stolen gold, as Dalton had claimed? Jewels? Something else entirely. It was none of those things. The box was filled almost to the brim with a thick, leather-bound ledger. The pages were covered in neat columns of elegant, flowing characters he recognized as Chinese. Alongside the script were rows of numbers and dates. Tucked beside the ledger was a small but heavy leather pouch. Liwi opened it and tipped its contents onto the table. A cascade of gleaming gold coins spilled out, shining brightly in the dim light of the cabin. Cassidy stared, bewildered. It wasn't a strongbox full of gold. It was a book and a handful of coins. This is what Dalton was hunting her for? He looked at her, his confusion plain. Liwi began to explain, her voice low and intense, the incomprehensible words weaving a story he could only decipher through her actions. She pointed to a line in the ledger, then to one of the gold coins. She held up one finger, then swept her hand wide, a gesture for many. She then made a motion of a whip striking a back, her face contorting with remembered pain and outrage. She repeated the sequence, pointing to the ledger, the coin, the gesture of many people, the whip. Understanding dawned on Cassidy, slow and horrifying. This wasn't a record of theft. It was a record of wages. The coins weren't what she had stolen. They were an example of what had been stolen from others. The ledger was proof. Proof of the railroad company and likely Sheriff Dalton exploiting the Chinese laborers, skimming their pay, enslaving them with debt, enforcing their will with violence. The whip. She wasn't a thief. She was a whistleblower, a messenger carrying evidence of profound corruption. The knife wound was not from a robbery gone wrong. It was from an escape. He looked at her with new eyes. The quiet, frightened woman was gone. In her place was a figure of immense courage. She had risked everything to expose this injustice. He slowly reached out and pushed one of the gold coins back toward her. He then tapped the ledger and gave her a firm nod of understanding. "I see." A wave of relief washed over her features. So powerful it was, as if a physical weight had been lifted from her shoulders. For the first time, a small, genuine smile touched her lips. She tapped his chest gently with her finger, then her own. She then linked her two index fingers together. A chain. En alliance. In the days that followed, a new routine settled over the ranch, one of tense vigilance and quiet communication. They were partners now, bound by a shared secret and a common enemy. He took to patrolling the perimeter of his property at dawn and dusk, his rifle always close at hand. Liwi, in turn, proved to be resourceful and observant. She would watch the horizon from the cabin window, her eyes sharp for any sign of dust that might signal Dalton's return. The language barrier remained, but they found ways to bridge it. They drew pictures in the dirt floor of the cabin. He drew a crude sketch of his ranch. She drew a map of the railroad camp and pointed to a specific location, a meeting place, he presumed. He taught her simple English words. "Water," he'd say, holding up a dipper. "Water," she would repeat, her pronunciation careful. "Food, danger, friend," she, in turn, taught him a few words of her own. "Anchuan." "Safe," he repeated, the sound foreign on his tongue. She smiled when he said it. He learned more about her from what she did than what she could say. He watched her mend one of his torn work shirts, her stitches small and perfect, a testament to a life of precision and care. He saw her tending to the small herb garden his mother had planted, her touch gentle and knowing. She was not the helpless victim he had first imagined. There was a deep well of resilience within her, a quiet dignity that commanded his respect. His initial disappointment over Phoebe had long since faded, replaced by a complex and growing admiration for the woman who had crash-landed into his life. This connection felt more real, more vital, than the one he'd built through carefully worded letters. One afternoon, a wagon appeared on the road. It wasn't Dalton. It was Samuel Crow, his nearest neighbor from 5 miles down the valley. Samuel was a pragmatic, no-nonsense man whose opinion Cassidy valued. He reined in his horse, his brow furrowed as he saw Liwi standing near the porch. "Cassidy," he said, his tone cautious. "Town's buzzin'. Dalton's put a bounty on some Chinese girl from the railroad. Says she's a thief and dangerous." His eyes rested on Liwi. "Looks like you found her before he did." Cassidy didn't deny it. "She's no thief, Samuel. Dalton seems to think so. He's gettin' a posse together. Says he's gonna search every homestead between here and the mountains." The threat was real and immediate. Cassidy's jaw tightened. "Dalton's the thief," he said, his voice low. "This woman has proof." Samuel looked from Cassidy's determined face to Liwi's steady gaze. He saw the rifle leaning against the cabin wall. He saw the way Cassidy stood, slightly in front of her, a clear protector. Samuel was a man who trusted his eyes more than gossip. He saw corruption in Dalton's greed and integrity in Cassidy's defiance. After a long pause, he gave a slow nod. "All right, Cassidy. I ain't seen a thing. But you watch your back. Dalton's not a man to be crossed." He paused again. "I'll be up on my ridge this evening, cleaning my rifle. Sometimes a fella can see a long way from up there." It was an offer. Promise. Samuel wouldn't interfere directly, but he would watch. He would be a witness. As Samuel rode away, Cassidy felt a surge of gratitude. He was not entirely alone. He turned to Liwi. He didn't have the words to explain what had happened, but she had read the exchange. She stepped forward and placed a hand on his forearm, a brief, firm touch. It meant everything. They were ready for the storm that was coming. The storm arrived 3 days later, not with thunder and rain, but with the thunder of hooves. Cassidy saw the dust cloud first, a roiling plume rising from the valley floor. It was too large for a single rider. He grabbed his rifle and called Liwi's name, She was already at the window, her face pale but her eyes resolved. She clutched the precious ledger, now wrapped in oilcloth, to her chest. "The root cellar," he commanded, pointing to the heavy wooden door set in the cabin floor. "Go. Now, don't come out, no matter what you hear." She looked at him, her eyes wide with fear for his safety. She shook her head, unwilling to leave him. "Go," he repeated, his voice harsher than he intended. He pushed her gently toward the door. "Anchuan," he said, using her word. "Safe." That seemed to break through her hesitation. She gave him one last, desperate look, then lifted the heavy door and descended into the darkness below, pulling it shut behind her. Cassidy slid a heavy chest over the door, concealing it just as Sheriff Dalton and 3 armed deputies reined their horses to a skidding halt in his yard. Dalton dismounted, a cruel smirk on his face. "End of the line, Flynn. My sources tell me you've been entertaining a guest. We're here to collect her, and the company property she stole." Cassidy stood on his porch, his Winchester held loosely but ready at his side. He didn't bother with lies this time. "There's no one here you want, Dalton. You need to leave my property." "I don't think so," the sheriff sneered. His men dismounted, fanning out, their rifles pointed at the cabin. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way. Give her up, and the box, and I might forget you lied to a lawman." "The only law I see here is the end of a gun," Cassidy retorted, his voice cold. "And the only thief I see is wearing a star." Dalton's face flushed with rage. The pretense was over. "You've made your choice, you fool," he nodded to his men. "Search the place. Tear it apart if you have to." As the first deputy took a step toward the porch, Cassidy raised his rifle. "That's far enough." The world seemed to hold its breath for a heartbeat, and then exploded into chaos. The deputy went for his gun, and Cassidy fired, not to kill, but to warn. The shot kicked up dirt at the man's feet, sending him stumbling backward. Dalton and the others returned fire immediately, splinters flying from the wooden porch posts around Cassidy's head. He ducked back, using the cabin wall for cover, and fired again, the rifle bucking against his shoulder. He was a good shot, a hunter, but he was outnumbered 4-1. The air filled with the deafening roar of gunfire and the acrid smell of burnt powder. A bullet tore through his sleeve, stinging his arm. He gritted his teeth, knowing he couldn't hold them off forever. They were closing in, using the water trough and his own wagon for cover. It was only a matter of time. Suddenly, a 5th shot rang out, this one from a much greater distance. It came from the ridge overlooking the ranch, the crack of the rifle echoing across the valley. One of Dalton's deputies yelped and dropped his gun, clutching a wounded shoulder. It was Samuel Crow making good on his promise. The distraction was momentary, but it was enough. It bought them precious seconds. As Dalton and his men turned their attention toward the ridge, a new sound joined the fray, the frantic drumming of hoofbeats and the rattle of a heavy coach, moving far too fast. It wasn't the regular stage. This one was dark, drawn by 4 powerful black horses, and it was thundering down the road toward the ranch. Dalton and his men stared, momentarily confused by this new arrival. The coach didn't slow. As it neared the cabin, rifle barrels poked through the windows. Before Dalton could react, a volley of precise, disciplined shots erupted from the coach. It wasn't a wild gunfight. It was a targeted assault. 2 of Dalton's men went down, their weapons clattering in the dust. The 3rd threw his hands up in surrender. The coach skidded to a halt. The doors flew open and several grim-faced Chinese men in dark suits leaped out, moving with an unnerving, silent efficiency. They surrounded the stunned and wounded deputies, disarming them in moments. Sheriff Dalton, his face a mask of disbelief and fury, found himself staring down the barrel of a pistol held by a man who had just stepped out of the coach. The man was impeccably dressed, his face calm and authoritative. He ignored Dalton completely. His eyes scanned the scene and found Cassidy, who stood on his porch, rifle still raised, utterly bewildered. The man's gaze then darted around, searching. "Liwi," he called out, his voice sharp and clear. Cassidy, still trying to process the sudden turn of events, slowly lowered his rifle. He moved the chest and threw open the root cellar door. Liwi scrambled out, blinking in the sudden light, the oilcloth-wrapped ledger clutched in her hands. When she saw the well-dressed man, her face broke with relief. She ran to him, speaking in a rapid torrent of their shared language. The man, Chun Wei, listened intently, his hand resting reassuringly on her shoulder. He then turned his attention to the captured sheriff. "Sheriff Dalton," he said, his English perfect and laced with ice. "I am Chun Wei. My associates and I represent the interests of the families whose sons you and your partners at the railroad have been robbing. We also carry federal warrants for your arrest." He gestured to the ledger in Liwi's hands. "My sister has provided us with all the evidence we need. Your reign of terror in this valley is over." Dalton sputtered, his face purple with impotent rage, as Chun Wei's men bound his hands. The fight was over as suddenly as it had begun. Cassidy watched, leaning against the porch rail, the adrenaline slowly draining out of him, leaving him trembling. Chun Wei approached him, his expression one of profound gratitude. "Mr. Flynn, my sister has told me what you have done. You protected her when you had every reason not to. You risked your life for a stranger. My family, and the families of all the men you have helped save, are in your debt." He made a gesture, and one of his men brought forward a heavy saddlebag. "A reward for your courage." Cassidy looked at the bag, then at Liwi, who was watching him, her dark eyes shining. He shook his head, pushing the bag away. "I don't want your money," he said, his voice raspy. "I did what was right." His gaze stayed locked on Liwi. The barrier of language seemed to melt away in that moment. He had seen her courage, and she had seen his. It was a language more powerful than words. Liwi stepped forward, away from her brother's side. She looked up at Cassidy, her face full of an emotion he was just beginning to understand. She spoke 3 words, her pronunciation slow and deliberate, words he had taught her, now filled with a new, profound meaning. "You, friend. Home." Chun Wei watched the exchange, a slow, knowing smile spreading across his face. He understood. "Mr. Flynn," he said quietly, "my sister was supposed to return with me. However, she has made it clear that her journey has ended here. If you will have her." Cassidy looked at this incredible woman, the unexpected passenger, the keeper of secrets, the brave messenger who had turned his quiet, lonely world upside down. He thought of the smiling woman in the photograph, Phoebe, a pale and distant dream. She was the woman he thought he wanted. But Liwi, with her fierce spirit and quiet strength, was the woman he now knew he needed. The silence of his life had not been a void waiting to be filled with chatter, but a space waiting for a purpose. She had given him that. He reached out and took her hand. "She's already home," he said. Months later, the silence of the ranch was a different kind. It was a comfortable quiet, punctuated by the murmur of 2 languages blending together, by the soft sound of Liwi humming a tune from her homeland as she worked in the garden, by the shared, easy laughter that needed no translation. The ledger she had carried had brought down Dalton and the corrupt railroad foreman, leading to federal investigations that returned stolen wages and dignity to hundreds of laborers. Justice had rippled out from this small, isolated ranch. Cassidy would often watch her as she moved about the cabin, her presence a constant, reassuring warmth. She was teaching him her language and he was teaching her his. They were building a bridge word by word, look by look, touch by touch. The loneliness that had once been his defining feature had been replaced by a partnership so profound it felt as if it had been destined all along. He had sent away for a simple promise of companionship, a mail-order bride to fit the shape of his life. Instead, fate had delivered a warrior, a hero, a partner who reshaped his world into something larger, richer, and more meaningful than he had ever dared to imagine. She was not the promise he was waiting for, but she was the answer to a prayer he never knew how to speak. Standing on his porch, watching the sun set over the plains they now called home, He knew with absolute certainty that his life had truly begun the day the wrong woman got off the stagecoach. Their story is a powerful reminder that the greatest connections often come from the most unexpected places, challenging our expectations and rewarding our courage to do what is right. What did you think of Cassidy's choice to protect a stranger? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to share this story with someone who appreciates tales of unexpected love and frontier justice.